day, my brothers and sisters. I'd like to welcome you to JCC Sunday Schools in Session, where Sunday school matters to God. Please take the time to like, subscribe, and comment to our lesson today. We're so excited to be with you today and share a word from God. As you can also find more about us on JordanChristianCenter.com. Our lesson today will be coming from 2 Samuel, the first chapter, verses 11 and 12, and 17 through 27. It is titled David's Grief for Saul and Jonathan. And as we remain in our learning of kings and leaders, our lesson today requires for us to focus on the character of David in the midst of grief. We'll observe how a leader who has been falsely accused and hunted like an animal by a jealous leader for years reacts. So before we go into the lesson, please, this life application of what godly leaders will do in the midst of a fallen comrade or a fallen person, we're going to see how we need to respond. And if we're careful, we can observe from the previous lesson how the contrasting differences between Saul's actions and David's actions here in this time. Let's get into the lesson so we can see what it has for us today. Verse 11 and 12 says, Then David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and likewise all the men that were with him, and they mourned and wept, fasted until even for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. Saul had attempted to kill David for more than 10 years now, but we see David's character as he develops into this godly leader. Once he hears about the death of his king and his friend, David is grieved. Instead of rejoicing because of Saul's death, he grieves, not just for his best friend Jonathan, but for the one who wanted him dead as well. David put the past behind him and focused on the loss. He focused on the good of Saul and not the bad. As Christians, we should mourn the loss of life, whether for a loved one or for those who we have difficulty with. We must put the past behind us and focus on the loss of life. Focus on the good of the person and not so much the things we hate or dislike about them. Life is precious, and the loss of life should be mourned and not celebrated. David was so grieved that he and his men rented their clothes. This was an outward demonstration of an inward grief. They were showing a devastation. This was a devastating blow for David, and the way he handled it, he begins to show his emotions. This lets us know as leaders, we too can feel the pain of losing those closest to us. And it's even all right to go in and show the grief, even if it's an outward expression on our behalf. We see here that he mourned them. He mourned the house of Israel. He mourned his best friend, and he also mourned that of Saul. And we can see David here is in a state of grief. Verse 17 and 18 says, And David lamented with his lamentations over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Also he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. David lamented, meaning he expressed a deep grief or sorrow over this loss. It is right to mourn again the loss of a loved one or a former associate. Many times we try to bottle that pain, but we see a man after God's own heart who shows us his pain being publicly shown to everyone. He mourns the loss of a father and a son, of a king and a best friend. And as this was not just a surface grief, he mourned deeply because he hurt deep down within his heart. Godly leadership will have compassion even for an enemy because the love of God was in them. David, like I said, looked at Saul as God's anointed and never wanted to do anything to harm God's anointed. He just figured even though God had anointed him king, God would all work it out in the end. And he didn't have the heart to go in and do anything that God had anointed as king or anointed for his purpose. We also see he wants a legacy of the bow to be taught to the generations. Is it important to tell the story of the good of a person, to keep their legacy of their good traits flowing? Many times it's easy to focus on the bad and those things that we don't really like about a person. But we see here David is showing us how to keep the legacy going of the good traits and not the bad traits. Verse 19 through 22 read, "The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of Philistine rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty is violently cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. For the blood of the slain from the fat of the mighty, and the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty." David honors his country, his anointed king, and his friend. He says the beauty of Israel is slain in high places, meaning the grace and beauty of Israel is like a gazelle as it gracefully glides over the mountains that has been now fallen. He's saying here that Israel, even Israel's grace and beauty as they will go in and praise upon this mountain, has now fallen. Israel's army, Israel's prince, and Israel's king are the mighty that have fallen to the hands of the enemy. For David, the loss of a leader, even a flawed leader like Saul, is still hard to bear. David did not want the Philistines to rejoice over this victory. He doesn't want any prosperity to come upon his enemy. He could not stand of thinking the uncircumcised standing there gloating over this victory over Israel, as it was customary for women to dance and sing when there was a decisive victory over an enemy, as it was here with the army of Israel. He didn't want to see that. He didn't want to have that celebration to come about. Our society teaches that in victory we should gloat over those who are defeated. But we see in David's case, the mere thought bothered him. In verse 21, David speaks of a curse as he was wanting no dew to fall in the land of Gilboa, where Saul and Jonathan died. In David's eye, they had killed God's anointed king, and there should be no case for a celebration again or prosperity by anyone. He says the shield of Saul has not been anointed. This is symbolizing the defeat and death of Saul. Verse 22 shows us that the sword and the bow fought with valor. He's saying Saul and Jonathan in David's eulogy is speaking of valor and heroic feats they had accomplished while living on this side of the land. Again, he's focused on the good of them and not the bad. We should never beat a man's reputation when he's down, or even when he's dead. Verses 23 through 27 says, "Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high place. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of a woman. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished?" David here eulogizes Saul and Jonathan, but he eulogizes them with honor. He did not focus on or mention any of Saul's faults. His words model how we should honor someone who is dead even now today. We should eulogize them with honor. We should show them respect. He says the lovely and the pleasantness is in their lives. Again, David is not focused on the attempts of Saul on his life, but rather he's showing the graciousness. He's showing a loving attitude and an attitude of forgiveness. He did not hold a grudge. He did not keep and harbor that hatred or grudge within the inside. He still showed grace. He still showed love. And he showed forgiveness. This is something that we should always, children of God, emulate. We should always be gracious. We should always have love. And we should always have the spirit of forgiveness living on the inside. These are those, like I say, characteristics of a leader we spoke about. He looks back over Saul's and Jonathan's life and is unable to see their faults. He is remembering only the good thing. He speaks to their bravery, Men who would not back down, who would fight to the end as a strong lion. He speaks of the prosperity the king brought to the land, to the nation, to the people. He speaks of how when he fought and brought back the spoils of war, how they was divided and spread out among the people. He says, weep, meaning cry and remember the blessings the king brought upon the nation. In verses 25 to 27, David now begins to focus on Jonathan. Jonathan, his best friend who was slain in his high place. And we realize in this high place was in Jonathan's own land and not the enemy. He goes on to describe the sincerity of the bond he and Jonathan had. In 1 Samuel 18:3, we see that they had loyalty amongst themselves. They were loyal to each other. They were noble. They had a nobleness in their friendship. And when we look at this here, this is how friends should be: loyal, respectful, and noble to one another. Their friendship is something, like I said, we should emulate today. Friendship that was greater than brotherhood. They felt that they was, like I say, real live brothers, as they made a covenant with one another. He finishes here in that 27th verse saying, as he gives closure to Saul and Jonathan, by calling them mighty. As we look at that, he says the mighty has fallen. And when the mighty has fallen, he's saying that even though they have died and went on, their legacy, what they did while they lived on this side, shall live and live forever. This has been a great lesson today. It allows us to see just how we can also be used by God, even in a time of grief, to be able to go in and look upon a situation and speak of the good in a person's life. God never wants us to be like the world, where we act like the world, talk like the world, and do like the world. We are always called to be set apart, to show the characteristics of God, even in the midst of some difficult times. Today, my brothers and sisters, as we looked at this here, we see David's character is that while we can understand he's a man after God's own heart. We too must emulate and be a man like David, as we try to emulate and be a man after God's own heart. This has been a great lesson today. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give us a like. Give us a comment as well. Let us know how we're doing with our lessons. If you need to more into the lesson, if you're looking for more to come from these lessons, let us know that too. We can go a lot more in depth than we normally do, but if that's something that people want, give us an opportunity to bring that to you by just letting us know, hey, I would like to get a little bit more in depth and really get down and exegete the scriptures. From that there, like I say, my brothers and sisters, it's been a blessing to be before you. I do apologize that I came a day late. Life kind of got a hold of me on Wednesdays. I normally try to post these on Wednesday. Life got a hold of me. I had to tend to fatherhood, husbandhood, priesthood, ministry, and all other kind of things on yesterday, and I wasn't able to get it out. But praise be to God, it was here today. So hopefully, like I said, if you like it, please give us a thumbs up. Please give us also some comments to let us know how we're doing. And also visit us on our webpage to see some other things that we have going on as well. Again, that is www.jordanchristiancenter.com. Until next week, my brothers and sisters, be blessed. Same time, same channel. Be blessed now.